Welcome back to my two-part series on Queen number ones. Although I'm not sure if it's a series, it is just 2 episodes. Either way, both of these videos are a bit of an exploration of the often touted fact that Queen are the only band where each member wrote more than one number one hit. The basic gist being that I don't think it's actually quite fair to say that. In the first of these 2 videos, which is already out and obviously you should watch first, I talked about the general list of number ones and those that are credited solely to Brian and Freddie, as well as the broader context on how to understand songwriting credits in popular music. In this video, I'll be talking about Roger and John's songwriting credits, as well as just wrapping it all up. So moving swiftly on then to John Deacon. He is solely credited with just 2 number one hits. Another One Bites the Dust, which I think was globally speaking their biggest single at the time, at least, and I Want to Break Free. So the thing is, with Another One Bites the Dust, I really don't think that we can fairly call John the sole songwriter. He certainly came up with the bass line, and we also know that he played much of the instrumentation on the track itself, including most of the guitar part. But John himself has said that the entire band added important ideas to the song, and their producer, Reinhold Mack, made it clear that Freddie's songwriting input in particular was pretty substantial. He said that Freddie was intrigued by what he heard on first listening, and he asked, "Have you got a line? What kind of vocals do you imagine?" To which John replied, "I haven't really got much, but something like Another One Bites the Dust." Freddie then said, "This is big. This is important. I'm going to spend a lot of time on this." He then fully committed himself to producing the track because he felt really strongly that it could be like a dancey hit. According to both Is This the Real Life and Queen All the Songs, which are 2 books that I've read a lot to research this episode, and I mentioned them in the last video as well, all 4 members of the band worked on the song, although Brian's contributions were pretty limited. In fact, from what I've read, both Brian May and Roger Taylor were pretty resistant towards the song in general. Brian has said that John and Freddie essentially had to coerce them into doing it. At least he went on to admit how wrong he was, because the song was huge and it was a massive success everywhere, in particular in America. But again, coming back to the important thing, I don't think we can sensibly say that John solely composed this. Although we don't have the full details of exactly who wrote what, it's clear that Reinhold was right in saying that John really didn't have much in terms of vocals or lyrics beyond Another One Bites the Dust before Freddie started to help. Which, right, Another One Bites the Dust is the name of the song. It's kind of the hook, but it's certainly not the entire song, and not enough to have made it the hit it was. To me, it clearly needed Freddie's input to turn it into what we all know and love today. Beyond Another One Bites the Dust, the only other John Deacon number one was I Want to Break Free. I do think this one has a pretty strong claim to be called a sole John composition, though I do think there's still an interesting story to tell about it. You've probably heard it if you're a big Queen fan, but I may as well just say it here because it is interesting. For years, I'd assumed, like I think a lot of people did, that the solo on this song, which is a synth solo, was played by Brian going through some kind of effect, or at the very least it had been composed by Brian on guitar and then played on a synthesizer. It feels so much like a Brian solo, the melodic sensibility, the tone, the general approach. But it's actually nothing to do with Brian. It's all down to the synth player Fred Mandel, who recorded the solo while the rest of the band were actually out at dinner. Beyond that, though, from everything I've read, it really does seem like a mostly, if not entirely, John composition. So for John, I'd say 1 out of 2 of his sole credited number ones can really be called a kind of sole composition. I just really don't think that Another One Bites the Dust can be called a sole composition by him. We know for a fact that Freddie in particular had a huge hand in turning it into what we all know today. So in my first video, I didn't say that much about Brian, and in this video, I've not really said much about John, but there's quite a lot to be said about Roger Taylor's songwriting. This is where things get quite messy, and I think actually quite interesting. So I don't want to pick on old Rog too much, but it does seem like it's his songs that tended to need the most work done by the rest of the band to turn them into the finished products. I mean, he is a drummer, so what else do you expect? So his two sole credited number ones are Radio Gaga and A Kind of Magic. And then, as I mentioned in the first video, there's also These Are the Days of Our Lives and The Invisible Man, which need to be discussed here. Let's work through these songs in no real apparent order. Again, as I've already said in the first of these two videos, These Are the Days of Our Lives was released as a double A-side with a 1990s Bohemian Rhapsody re-release. So I'm a little unsure how to count this. On the one hand, it's a genuinely very popular song. It won the band a Brit Award. It is seen today as their definitive swan song, given its wistful lyrics and the fact it was released just after Freddie's death. It also got a load of radio play at the time, and it's still well loved. But it was attached to an already very well-known song, frankly, in my opinion, much better song that had already reached number one across the world. So surely this single, and therefore this number one, can't be credited solely to Roger either way, can it? It's a double A-side after all, so it should at least be understood as a Mercury number one as well, I think. Honestly, double A-sides are kind of weird. They're just singles where a band or record company has decided to equally promote both sides of a single rather than just one. But for the most part, people end up liking one side much more than the other. It's like Paul McCartney and Wings, Mull of Kintyre, and Girls' School. Technically a double A-side, but only one song is actually very well known today, and the other is kind of weird. A bit gross, maybe. It hasn't aged well. And then, kind of sticking to the Beatles world, Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields by the Beatles was also a double A-side, but in spite of the huge popularity of both songs, most people kind of tend to count Penny Lane as the real number one. So These Are the Days of Our Lives is a weird one, and I'm not really sure how to include it as a sole composed number one song. If it had managed to reach the top of the charts solely on its own as an A-side, which it probably would have given Freddie's very recent death and given how big Queen were and still are in the UK. So if it had been released as its own A-side with something else as the B-side, rather than this weird double A-side with Bohemian Rhapsody's 1990s re-release, I might say otherwise, but as it stands, it's kind of a Mercury Taylor number one. And weirdly, anyway, the song is actually credited to the entire band because that's just the arrangement they actually had by that point. As I said, it is a bit of a mess. I don't know how to include it. And the thing is, it does genuinely seem to be Roger's strongest contender for a sole composed number one, as from what I've read, it is mostly, if not entirely, attributable to him. I couldn't find lots of details on the songwriting history of it, but that is precisely why I'm led to believe that it is as simple as Roger wrote the vast majority of it, at least lyrically and in terms of the chord progression. Unfortunately though, neither A Kind of Magic nor Radio Gaga can be claimed to be written just by Roger. Both of these songs really needed quite substantial help from other band members to turn them into the hits we know. On Radio Gaga, Freddie had a whole week to work at turning it from Roger's first demo into the version we all know while the drummer was off on a skiing holiday. So when writing songs for their new album, which was to become The Works, everyone had been tasked with writing something. According to Freddie, Roger wrote 3 or 4 songs, and as far as I was concerned, they weren't good enough. Freddie then instructed Taylor to come up with something better. This led him to writing the initial version of Radio Gaga. At first, May and Taylor cooperated on the song before they split, and May used most of his ideas for another track, Machines or Back to Humans. Taylor then hid away in a studio for 3 days with a synthesizer and a drum machine. Freddie said, "I think Roger was thinking about it as just another track, but I instantly felt there was something in there, a really good, strong, saleable commodity." It's at this point that Rog went skiing and told the singer to do what he wants. Radio Gaga then went on to give Queen a number 1 hit in Italy, Belgium, Germany, Ireland, and Sweden. In Freddie's own words, with John's songs or Roger's songs, I'm sort of getting there at the early stage. They don't mind me sort of tearing it apart and then piecing it all back together every way. Sometimes I'll take the whole song over, like Radio Gaga. I just instantly felt that there was something. There was going to be something in there. So I virtually took it over, and he went on a skiing holiday for about a week, and he said, okay, do what you want. So come on. I mean, come on. Are we honestly going to say that Roger wrote this song by himself, given what we now know? Again, I'm not here to crap on Roger, maybe a little bit, but we need to be realistic. And the thing is, it's actually a very similar story with A Kind of Magic, which also hit #1, this time in Argentina. And it's a great song. I really love it. But Freddie, again, played a huge part in its composition. Freddie worked on it whilst Roger was absent again, this time away attending spotting sessions for the music video, which is fair enough. According to the book, Queen, All the Songs, Freddie significantly reworked the song. And in another book, Is This the Real Life? It says that while A Kind of Magic would be solely credited to Taylor, Mercury had a significant part to play. Freddie got a bee in his bonnet and he said to Roger, "You go away and I'll make a hit." That's what Brian said in 2010. "I knew he was going to LA for a week," recalled Mercury, "and I got a hold of it and I changed it around completely." So just like Radio Gaga, Freddie took the drummer's song believing it had much greater commercial potential than anyone else realized. Roger himself said, "We were knowingly making a pop record, a commercial record." According to Brian, the original was quite lugubrious and heavy, a million miles away then from the finished single. It seems that all that really remains of Roger's original go at it are the lyrics, which are based in part on lines from the greatest film of all time, Highlander. I always wish the film actually burst into the Queen song at that scene. It just would have made it so much better. So beyond those songs, there's also Invisible Man. Now, it's not actually a dreadful song. I like to joke about it occasionally, but it's not horrendous, but it is amongst one of Queen's least impressive singles. Roger himself has never really tried to take much credit for this one. There really is no doubt either way, though, that everyone in the band contributed significantly to the track. I'm to blame for that one, sort of. Everyone came in and that went through quite a few changes due to everyone else putting in different bits and restructuring it, etc. I don't quite remember where the ideas did come from. I think it came from a book I was reading and it just seemed to fit in with a rhythmic pattern I had in mind. He certainly seems to have come up with the original idea then, but it was developed bit by bit in the studio by everyone and is, to be fair, credited to everyone. So I'm not going to count it as a sole Roger songwriting attempt here. So why am I bringing it up? Well, the interesting thing is that this song definitely would have been credited to just Roger had it been released just a few years earlier. But no one ever credits this solely to Roger. Quite rightly, because like most of his songs, he needed quite a bit of help turning his ideas into the final thing. But my point is that this song shows how incredibly contingent this Queen fact about #1s is upon the specific arrangements the band had at any point in time, rather than any real description of songwriting reality. So let's step back for a second again and just look at all the #1s and we'll see how everything stands now. So these are all the songs that hit #1 in any country and are given a sole songwriting credit. So we have Bohemian Rhapsody, Somebody to Love, Crazy Little Thing Called Love, all by Freddie. We have Flash and We Will Rock You by Brian. I Want to Break Free, Another One Bites the Dust by John, and then A Kind of Magic and Radio Gaga by Roger Taylor. And then for Roger, there are both Invisible Man and These Are the Days of Our Lives, which certainly would have been given sole credit to Roger had they been released just a few years earlier, but are actually credited to the band as a whole. So, from the top, if we're going to be super unrealistically anal and pedantic, right, then likely none of these are really soul composed, as I said in part 1. I'm sure Roger's drum parts are all his own, the same for John's bass playing. Freddie will almost always have played around with the lyrics and vocal melodies he was given, sometimes actually quite a lot, and Brian was left to play whatever he wanted on guitar, although with the occasional bit of guidance. But that is no different from 99% of music ever written and recorded, and certainly true of every pop and rock band. So let's not hold them to that ridiculous standard. I think by the standards of any other popular music band, which is obviously the standard which we should be using when we're comparing bands, we can happily count all three of Freddie's and both of Brian's songs as solely composed. Well done, guys. I think maybe we could make a case that Bohemian Rhapsody might ideally have Brian's name listed as well as a co-composer, given how important his guitar parts are. But in some bands, he'd get the credit, and lots of others he wouldn't, so let's not split hairs. I think I Want to Break Free is also quite fairly a sole John composition, again, by the standards we overwhelmingly find in popular music. The synth solo, as great as it is, seems to be the only thing of significance contributed by someone else, and I don't think that's big enough to take away from John. I am less inclined, though, unfortunately, to say Another One Bites the Dust is for the reasons I've just talked about. John came up with the idea, certainly he came up with the bass line too, which is great, but Freddie played a huge part in the songwriting for this song. And then with Roger, there is no doubt whatsoever that his sole credited number ones had a lot. I mean a lot of help from others. Just loads. Freddie in particular worked on each song for a week while Roger was off gallivanting. And other songs that originated with Roger, Invisible Man and These Are the Days of My Life, were written and released after they changed their arrangement, so accredited to the entire band. And Invisible Man, for one, can in no way be called a sole Roger composition. These Are the Days of My Life, I think we probably would call a sole Roger composition from what I've been able to research, but was it a sole composed Roger number one, given that it was a double A-side with Bohemian Rhapsody? Meh, I don't think so. So unsurprisingly, but no offense to Roger, it is the drummer that lets the team down in terms of songwriting. Freddie gets 3, Brian gets 2, John gets 1, and Roger doesn't quite get 1, in my opinion. So, at the end of the day, Roger did end up doing a Ringo. Anyway, what are we actually left with here? Right, as I keep saying, in popular music, we very, very rarely hear a song that is completely, truly, entirely sole composed by one person. Whether it's, Bob Dylan or Joanna Newsom or almost anyone, there's usually someone else there contributing really valuable musical ideas to their songs, to their tracks, even if what's written in the credits don't reflect that. But I think that we can clearly just accept that that's how it works. As I've already said, each band has their own arrangement and agreements how to credit songs. For Queen, that arrangement was, up until the late 80s, simply whoever came up with the song idea gets the credit. Obviously, that leaves a huge amount of room for the other members to contribute without getting any credit. And that happened a lot. It led to loads of disagreements in the band. As I've already said, people felt their input wasn't being acknowledged properly. Luckily, though, it wasn't that big of a problem. And as Freddie himself was known to bluntly acknowledge, that was simply due to the fact that, well, the money kept flowing to all of them anyway. So they never had that much to whinge about. But and I think for me, this is the important bit. It shouldn't really surprise anyone that Queen, like all bands, had a very, very uneven distribution of songwriting talent. And part of my problem with the mythology around the band, a mythology that this purported fact propagates, is that there wasn't an uneven distribution of songwriting talent. I see loads of people online and in real life talking about the band and the individual members as if they're all just absolute top tier genius songwriting Jedi, and it's just unfortunately not the case. I think we all instinctively know that isn't true. Just think about Roger's music outside of Queen. Just listen to Brian's solo albums. Oh wait, what was that? You've never listened to them? Well, of course you haven't. You're not really going to unless you're a massive super fan. I've listened to them. They're not really that great. Even Freddie's stuff isn't anywhere near as good as Queen's stuff, even though he was probably the best outside of the context of Queen. But you know what? That's perfectly fine. They're not all amazing songwriters all the time, and they were all at their best in the context of Queen, in the collaborative environment of the band as a whole. As I just said, even Freddie, his solo stuff is occasionally enjoyable, but not up to the best standards of Queen. And again, that's fine. That's every band pretty much. I'm a huge fan of the Beatles. I think they're great. I mean, they're pretty much the best band ever, obviously. I still think that the Beatles did their best work as members of the Beatles rather than as solo artists. And I think there's actually quite a big dip in quality there, even if it is still good. The thing is, this mythology about Queen, in my opinion, is definitely worth tackling. Every band and every artist has like their own mythology promoted by, if not their casual fans, then by their like super fans. You know, super fans are those who not only like or love the music made by their favorite artists, but actively promote their work. They're essentially the proselytizers. They're trying to turn everyone else into fans and super fans. Not that there's anything wrong with that. To be fair, band mythologies usually have some basis in truth. They're rarely complete bullshit, but that doesn't mean that they're 100% true either. So let's just take as another example, David Bowie. There's one video in particular that is often used as evidence for what we might call the myth of Bowie's genius. Now, just to be clear, just me calling it a myth doesn't mean that Bowie wasn't a genius, nor am I now saying he definitely was a genius. I don't think there's a kind of conclusive way to say who or what a genius is. Anyway, the video I'm talking about is this video.
I don't think that some of the claims being made for it are hugely exaggerated. I mean, when the telephone was invented, people made amazing claims.
I know the
NGs,
president,
for example.
The president at the time when it was first invented, he was outrageous. He said he foresaw the day in the future when every town in America would have a telephone. Now how dare he claim like that? Absolute bullshit. No, you see, I don't agree. I don't agree. I think the internet. I don't think we've even seen the tip of the iceberg. I think the potential of what the internet is going to do to society, both good and bad, is unimaginable. I think we're actually on the cusp of something exhilarating and terrifying.
It's just a tool, though, isn't it?
No, it's not. No, it's an alien life form.
What do you think? I mean, when you think then about the
Is
future
there life on Mars? Yes, it's just landed here.
You see, the myth of Bowie's genius seems to be that he was not only a brilliant musical artist, but that he was more broadly a uniquely insightful cultural critic, a visionary, and maybe even a futurist. You know, this is a man who gets humanity, he gets society. Wow, what genius he had, right? But this video is from 1999. By that point, being aware of the internet and thinking it would likely change society in radical ways wasn't really a novel insight. It might not yet have been completely mainstream, but Bowie need only have talked to a couple techie nerds to hear such ideas. Computer science guys had been saying that sort of thing for a good while at that point. And in 1999, we were mere months away from the dot-com bubble bursting. That sort of thinking then may not have been super common, but it wasn't super rare either. And Jeremy Paxman being a bit skeptical about it isn't crazy. It doesn't make him ignorant. I can't help but find this funny. Tons of people have commented on this video saying, well, Bowie is clearly much smarter than Paxman here, huh? Jeremy Paxman's job is to challenge and disagree. Sure, sometimes it makes for actually bad reporting, just being contentious for the sake of it, but this video doesn't prove Bowie's genius, nor does it prove Paxman's limited intellect. He's clearly a very smart guy. Nonetheless, I think there's still a core of truth to this mythology about David Bowie. For a popular musician, Bowie was clearly unusually well informed on cultural, social, and political issues. He was certainly a sharp guy and eloquent. He was interested in current developments and he had opinions on things outside of the music he made. Opinions that were, importantly, actually well informed. That's very rare, I think, for a popular musician. After all, most simply wouldn't have thought to stay up to date on those sort of technological goings-on. After all, most popular musicians simply wouldn't have thought to stay up to date with those sort of technological happenings. That definitely counts for something. And I certainly think that attitude informs a lot of his music. It's what made David Bowie, David Bowie. That still doesn't make him a genius level futurist or cultural commentator or anything like that. Queen's mythology is very different, of course. They're a very different band, so you would expect that, but it's interesting to note how the Queen mythology interacted with the Bowie mythology in the initial critical reactions to Under Pressure, a collaboration between the two artists. As far as music journalists at the time were concerned, Bowie was doing Queen a huge favor by writing and recording a song with them. Queen were certainly popular, but according to the sneering critics, they weren't cool. David Bowie definitely was and is. Even here, this quite obviously, I think, unfair characteristic of the Bowie-Queen collaboration isn't entirely accurate, or it doesn't entirely miss the mark. The respective mythologies of the band sort of align with the framing. The topic of this entire 2-video series has been about a commercial record claimed by Queen fans, and commercial or popular success is central to the image of Queen in popular culture. They are unabashedly a populist band. They were always thinking about not just how successful their singles would be, obviously all bands do that, but how they would be heard live, how audiences would be able to interact with their songs. Queen might not have been an unusually commercially oriented band, but they were unusually good at thinking that way. And lots of the quotes I've used from band members in each part of this video back this up. They were always thinking, what sort of hit would this song be? How can we make sure that people are going to want to listen to this on the radio and in stadiums? And can people dance to it? And the thing is, that is no bad thing at all. I'm definitely not saying this in any kind of pejorative way. I think the brilliance of Queen, the thing that they are the absolute best at, bar none, comes directly from that really confident, in-your-face, populist attitude. We will rock you, don't stop me now, we're the champions, Radio Gaga. In a way, that's just one side of Queen, but in a way, it's kind of everything about Queen. These are songs that only Queen could have written, and only they could have made them as good and as big as they were. Obviously, they were also artistically sophisticated too, and I don't think the two are antonyms anyway. The point is that I do kind of get why the mythology around Queen would be more oriented around these claims about #1 hits and who wrote what, as opposed to, say, David Bowie's, which is more around being an intellectually sophisticated, smart artist and cultural observer. But of course, the thing is, both David Bowie and Queen are both things. They are both commercial and populist, and they're both sophisticated and smart. All artists who have achieved any level of enduring popular success are, I think. So maybe not all in the exact same ways or to the same extent, but still. Anyway, ultimately, after all of that, you don't have to agree with me or any of the arguments I've made in these 2 videos about Queen. If you are still happy to say that Queen are the only band where each member wrote a #1 hit, well, obviously I can't stop you anyway. It's in a way not 100% wrong, but I do think it misses out a lot of the story, a lot of interesting context and background. When you're comparing one band to other bands, as the statement is inherently doing, it makes more sense to try to compare them on even ground. Because of Queen's songwriting credit arrangements, and because of the way every band or artist ever credits songs is different, the ground inherently isn't even, right? So we're not comparing apples to apples just by looking at the listed names on credits. So I think understanding all of this is actually both interesting and useful. And more broadly, I think it's just really important to be sensitive to the myths we build our favorite artists into. There's nothing wrong necessarily with doing this either. It is part of the fun, of listening to our favorite music or consuming our favorite art. But the myth isn't reality, even when it is shaped by it. So I think I've made my point now. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video. I have been very busy recently, so it took me much longer than usual to getting around to actually writing and recording and then editing these latest 2 videos. But there are more on the way, hopefully about other stuff you're interested in as well. Please check out my other videos and think about subscribing or sharing this video even maybe, or leave a comment, or don't. Up to you really.